Mr. Vice President, Your Excellencies, the report before you describes the deterioration of the human rights situation in Afghanistan, now exacerbated by the deep humanitarian crisis. And I take this opportunity to send my condolences to all those affected by the earthquake that hit Nangarhar and Kunar provinces last week. Since 2021, the de facto authorities have announced a plethora of edicts and laws that violate the human rights of the people of Afghanistan. Women and girls face extreme forms of gender-based discrimination and oppression that amount to systematic gender persecution. These impact every part of their lives. Their education, with girls banned from secondary education since 2021, their employment, their health, and their access to civic space and the enjoyment of freedom of expression. The propagation of virtue and prevention of vice law passed last year targets the autonomy of women and girls by governing their appearance, their behavior, and their social conduct. It restricts women's mobility without a male guardian, controls their dress, and even authorizes the concealment of their voices. The law is enforced by some 3,300 male inspectors across the country, including through arrests and even physical violence. Enforcement has expanded to family members, religious leaders, and neighbors, deepening discrimination throughout society. Policies, decrees, and directives severely restrict women's employment, both in the public and the private sectors, and in non-governmental organizations. The ban on women's medical training is devastating to the right of Afghanistan's women and girls to health, including sexual and reproductive services, in a country with one of the highest maternal mortality rates in the world. While women are the main focus of the propagation of virtue and prevention of vice law, more than half of arbitrary detentions by March 2025 also involved men, men's hairstyles, or non-attendance at prayers. Other policies and practices implemented since the de facto authorities seized power 4 years ago include public executions and the infliction of corporal punishment in public. They have imposed severe restrictions on civic space and media freedom through a system characterized by censorship, intimidation, and detention. By November 2024, our United Nations monitoring revealed 256 arrests and 130 cases of torture or ill-treatment of media professionals. Mr. Vice President, Your Excellencies, the humanitarian crisis in Afghanistan is compounded by the forced return of over 2 million Afghans from neighboring countries this year alone, particularly from Iran and Pakistan. Most returnees are practically destitute, with few assets or job prospects. As many key donor states have cut their humanitarian and development funding this year, support to returning families has fallen significantly, while sanctions and frozen state assets continue to cripple Afghanistan's economy. My office urges all countries to end the forced return of Afghan refugees and to protect those at risk against refoulement. In the meantime, the international community must step up its support and respond to chronically underfunded humanitarian appeals. This report also reflects on victims' and survivors' perspectives on justice and redress, building on last year's report that took stock of options for accountability. In interviews conducted in 2020 and 2021, the United Nations mission in Afghanistan, UNAMA, found that little had been done to acknowledge harm or to provide victims and survivors with reparations. Many expressed a desire for criminal prosecutions, acknowledgement, and compensation. Other processes led by the Afghan Independent Human Rights Commission some 20 years ago, and more recently by the International Criminal Court, yielded similar results. Civil society initiatives on victim-centered justice have faced a challenging environment due to the complex nature of the past conflict, lack of awareness of atrocities, and fear of reprisals. It is important to listen to the voices of victims and survivors, to understand their expectations and priorities for truth, justice, and reparations. The results of various consultation processes, as set out in the report, provide a solid starting point. What is clear is that accountability efforts must be multidimensional and pursued through a variety of different but complementary tracks, rather than limited to a single process or mechanism focused on criminal justice. They should apply the full array of transitional justice elements, including truth-seeking, justice, reparation, guarantees of non-recurrence, and memorialization. At the same time, the international community needs to support the independent investigation and prosecution of all violations of international human rights and humanitarian law, including those committed by foreign forces during decades of conflict. Your Excellencies, these ongoing violations require action by both the de facto authorities and the international community. The de facto authorities need to take urgent action to comply with international human rights law by rescinding discriminatory laws, edicts, decrees, and policies that deny human rights and fundamental freedoms of the Afghan people, especially women and girls. They need to enable women and girls to access healthcare, secondary and university education, and work, respecting their freedom of movement and ending interference in their daily lives. They need to implement a complete moratorium on executions with a view to the abolition of the death penalty, and they need to end corporal punishment. And they need to respect the right to freedom of expression and remove restrictions on the media. Mr. Vice President, the international community and all member states more generally need to find ways to engage with and influence the de facto authorities to meet Afghanistan's international human rights obligations. This will require sustained efforts of engagement through dialogue and incentives, as well as through the pursuit of accountability. It remains crucial to find ways to meet the basic needs and the aspirations of the Afghan people in an increasingly precarious humanitarian situation. It is only through a comprehensive approach, rooted in both the immediate and the longer-term needs and expectations of Afghans, that Afghanistan will achieve stability and sustainable development. Together, we must work for a future Afghanistan that is at peace with itself and its neighbors, and where the human rights of all Afghans are fully respected. Thank you, Mr.